Hey guys, tonight we're slipping under the covers of a world that's dimly lit by gas lamps, tightly laced with corsets, and, well, not exactly known for restful sleep. You're in a bedroom now, in Victorian London. The wallpaper's trying too hard. There's a faint smell of lavender, coal smoke, and moral dread. The pillows are stuffed with goose down, the bedposts carved with uncomfortable detail, and you, unfortunately, have been awake for the last 5 nights because someone told you desire was dangerous and that thinking about ankles might lead to ruin. Victorian England had a strange relationship with sleep. For a society so obsessed with propriety, they had surprisingly loose definitions of nighttime wellness. Insomnia wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a symptom of spiritual decay, nervous exhaustion, or, depending on whom you asked, possibly demonic temptation in your bloodstream. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is over there. I love knowing who's drifting off and when. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit upright in a four-poster bed dressed like a sofa, ornate, overstuffed, and deeply judgmental. It's the 1870s. Your doctor told you not to read too much, especially novels with strong female characters. Your housemaid suspects you've been having unladylike dreams. You tried chamomile, prayer, and a fainting couch. Nothing works, because insomnia in this era is not a condition. It's a confession, a late-night whisper from your body that perhaps you are ungoverned. The upper classes, of course, had more time to be neurotic about it. Their evenings were long, their bedrooms lavish, and their minds filled with carefully repressed cravings. It wasn't just that they couldn't sleep, it's that sleep was a luxury of the innocent, and they were, in theory, too enlightened for innocence. Sex with Kings by Eleanor Herman offers a particularly juicy portrait of sleepless at court. Take, for instance, poor Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, who endured a life of royal obligation and very little privacy. She once remarked, with admirable sarcasm, that sleep was something one might afford if His Majesty's passions were ever as brief as his temper. Legend says her bedroom had secret doors for mistresses and ministers alike, and no one ever knew which would appear after dark. The medical world wasn't much help either. According to Michel Foucault in The History of Sexuality, the Victorian age saw a profound shift in how the body was policed, not by guards but by routines. Doctors prescribed sleep not as rest, but as discipline. 8 hours wasn't a target, it was a moral obligation. If you couldn't sleep, you were either reading the wrong things, harboring unspoken lust, or committing crimes in your subconscious, possibly all three. And so emerged a cottage industry of sleep reformers. Bedtime was choreographed. No spicy foods, no alcohol, unless it was port wine for nerves. No excitement of the mind, which included conversation after 8 p.m. or being exposed to opinions. You laugh, but entire books were written about how too much intellectual stimulation could inflame the nerves, especially in women. Oh, women had it rough. If you were a sleepless Victorian lady, there was always the looming threat of hysteria, a diagnosis so vague it covered everything from irritability to smiling at a stranger for too long. The most common treatment? Isolation, tepid baths, and long talks with a doctor who thought Freud was too radical. More often than not, your insomnia was explained away by unexpressed sexual frustration, which you were then advised to ignore even harder. Historians still argue whether this blanket diagnosis was a reflection of patriarchal fear or genuine medical ignorance. Probably both. Either way, Victorian nights were long and filled with quiet despair and doolies. And it wasn't just the ladies. Upper-class men faced a different kind of bedroom pressure. A gentleman was expected to conquer the world by day and be a chaste beacon of control by night. Unfortunately, control doesn't turn off when the curtains are drawn. Many ended up in physicians' offices complaining of nightly emissions and erotic dreams, symptoms that suggested too much imagination and not enough horseback riding. One quirky tidbit buried in late 19th century medical journals: it was briefly fashionable among some London men to sleep standing up with their arms bound in order to prevent touching themselves. Yes, Victorian kink was deeply unsexy. So you lie awake now, wrapped in a blanket that smells like mothballs and the tears of colonial guilt. Outside, a gas lamp flickers. Somewhere down the street, a coach clatters over cobblestone, and you wonder if it's too late to sneak a chapter of Lady Audley's Secret. You probably won't survive this century's bedtime routine, but at least you'll go out knowing that even Queen Victoria sometimes faked a headache. You wake again. Not that you ever truly slept. The fire's gone out in the grate, the coals curled into ashy ghosts. Your eyelids sting from the dryness of gaslight, and your ears ring faintly with something mechanical. Tick, tick, tick. You glance toward the clock on your mantelpiece. It is an ornate brass creature with Roman numerals and far too much self-esteem. It's 3:12 a.m. Welcome to another sleepless Victorian night. See, insomnia in the 19th century wasn't just a medical curiosity. It was becoming a social epidemic. And one of the chief culprits? Noise. Not the honking, glowing urban buzz we know today. No, this was the subtle, creeping invasion of the machine. The Industrial Revolution had crept into bedrooms like soot under the door. The hiss of gas jets, the grind of late-night carriages, the hum of a new contraption called the sewing machine, rattling behind closed curtains because someone's maid is trying to make ends meet. London and its cousins had become 24-hour organisms. The Victorian city never truly slept, unless, of course, it could afford to. Historians still argue whether the rise of insomnia was physiological or simply the predictable result of over-civilization. But what's not debated is the growing awareness of nighttime overstimulation. By 1850, newspapers were filled with anxious letters from readers begging for cures. One gentleman even proposed that the government install public sleep houses to offer peace to the chronically alert. Parliament ignored him. In homes of the slightly unhinged wealthy, doctors made house calls with stopwatches and silence meters. One lady in Kensington banned all servants from speaking past sundown. She insisted even her canary be draped in velvet by dusk. She later died of melancholic fatigue, which is a very Victorian way of saying this woman needed a nap and a friend. Enter then the age of sleep hygiene and its bizarre sidekick, bedtime lust cures. Let's talk about the gentleman again. For the industrious, unmarried man of means, insomnia was almost expected. He worked too hard, thought too much, and likely repressed everything. As such, an entire catalog of nighttime remedies emerged, most of them deeply unhelpful. Cold baths were a popular suggestion. The theory was that sudden exposure to cold would cool the blood, particularly the lustful blood, which doctors at the time imagined surged around the body like soup on a boil. Another method involved sitting upright on hard chairs in complete darkness, thinking of the Queen, botany, or better yet, nothing at all. Some gentlemen were so committed to not dreaming of women that they hired night watch butlers to gently wake them if they twitched too suggestively. It didn't work. From Sex with Kings, there's a rather awkward tale of Frederick the Great of Prussia, admittedly a bit pre-Victorian, but a favorite in anxious monarch lore, who is said to have shared his sleeping quarters with a flute and a large dog named Biche, rather than a wife. He preferred musical distraction and canine loyalty over intimacy, believing women spoiled the rhythm of rest. Whether that was true or simply a coded escape from expectation, we'll never really know. But we do know he suffered from epic insomnia, which may explain a few of his military choices. Meanwhile, in the bedrooms of the deeply religious, sleeplessness was associated with temptation. This is where things took a particularly strange turn. A fringe practice emerged called pre-confessional stillness. Followers would lie motionless before bed, silently accounting for any sins, especially sexual thoughts, they may have had during the day. Some did this for hours. It was part prayer, part mental chess, and all misery. One pamphlet from 1864 suggested placing pins in one's collar to catch the head if it drooped during night reflection. Another suggested reciting the names of deceased saints backward. And while these gentlemen were agonizing over impure thoughts, their wives were doing battle with their own nocturnal demons, the corset and the chloral bottle. Chloral hydrate, known casually as knockout drops, was prescribed widely to women with what we'd now call stress-induced insomnia. The dosage varied from a spoonful to, well, until she no longer troubles herself with worries. It worked for a while. Then it caused hallucinations, dependency, and dreams so vivid they made the evening newspapers. But corsets were the real culprit. Imagine trying to sleep in a whalebone exoskeleton that's pressing your ribs into your liver while simultaneously demanding you remain appealing to a husband who thinks desire is a sign of madness. Even unfastened, corsets left marks, bruises, and a sense of bodily confinement that lingered well past midnight. And yet, amid this tension, a quiet rebellion was underway. Some women, fed up with silence and sedation, turned to secret nighttime rituals. These included reading novels by candlelight, experimenting with herbal elixirs from apothecaries too discreet to ask questions, and yes, even whispering fantasies into their pillows. Erotic imagination became a quiet form of protest. As Peter Webb notes in The Erotic Spirit Through History, the imagination became a refuge. One's inner life, the erotic dream, the imagined kiss, became more reliable than the marriage bed. Victorian households didn't talk about this, of course, but they dreamed about it. Often, the clatter of the clock returns, still ticking, always ticking. A gentle rhythm now, like a heartbeat muffled by lace. You shift under the blankets, wondering if maybe, just maybe, tonight you'll sleep. You won't. Not yet. But you will hear more secrets before morning. You're pacing again. Quietly. Slippers on thick carpet, the hem of your dressing gown whispering like a scandal across the parquet floor. Somewhere in the next room, a lamp flickers. You know you should be in bed. Proper Victorians are horizontal by 10. But your nerves hum like piano wires, and your thoughts are, well, not very Anglican. Hysteria, they called it. A distinctly feminine ailment, or so the doctors insisted. By the mid-1800s, this elusive diagnosis had bloomed into an entire branch of questionable science. Hysteria wasn't just a medical condition. It was a catch-all label for anything remotely inconvenient about women. Too tired? Hysteria. Too lively? Hysteria. Sleepwalking, insomnia, fondness for fiction? You guessed it. And when the doctor arrived, black coat, polished shoes, bags filled with unpleasant objects, he came not to listen, but to treat. Treatment, of course, was its own theater. One wildly popular approach was the pelvic massage, meant to relieve congestion of the womb and produce a paroxysm, which, incidentally, resembled what we would now call an orgasm. But Victorians didn't use that word. In fact, they went to tremendous lengths to avoid the idea that such reactions had anything to do with desire. These women, the medical logic insisted, weren't enjoying themselves, they were being cured. Historians still argue whether doctors truly believed what they were doing was therapeutic, or if they were merely indulging a cultural blind spot the size of Westminster Abbey. Eleanor Herman, in Sex with Kings, describes how royal mistresses often spoke of their melancholy spells as being resolved not by court intrigue, but by gentle companionship, or, if one was lucky, discreet physical attention. So perhaps the line between madness and loneliness was thinner than we think. For many middle and upper class women, being diagnosed with hysteria was oddly empowering. It meant you could lie down, draw the curtains, and ask for time alone. It meant more rarely that someone would actually touch you, albeit under clinical circumstances. That's how the age of the medical orgasm began. And yes, that's how the vibrator came to be. By the 1880s, doctors were exhausted, literally. Pelvic massage was time-consuming and required a certain stamina. Thus, the invention of electromechanical devices, large, buzzing instruments meant to relieve congestion without tiring the physician. Early advertisements made no mention of pleasure, of course. They used phrases like nervous relief and domestic tranquility. The devices were sold alongside hair curlers and butter churners. In some department stores, you could buy them right next to the sewing machines. Peter Webb points out that the rise of these devices marked one of the only moments in Western history where female pleasure was mass-produced, but still entirely denied. Think about that. A nation of women being treated in parlor rooms by machinery under the pretense that they were simply very, very anxious. And what caused all this anxiety? Well, everything. Let's not forget the layers of social corsetry, which in many ways were tighter than the physical ones. A Victorian woman was expected to be pious, obedient, chaste, and endlessly pleasant. She must never express desire, but she must always remain desirable. She should have children, but she must never suggest she knows how that happens. And if she couldn't sleep at night because she was boiling with contradictions and loneliness, well, that must be the womb again. acting up, as usual. One quirky case comes from an 1872 physician's diary. A woman, referred to only as Mrs. T, visited weekly for chronic fatigue, nightmares, and what her husband called unwholesome dreams. The doctor prescribed regular massage treatments, followed by a glass of warm milk and a reading from the Psalms. She improved dramatically. The husband, however, began suffering from headaches. It said he requested a transfer to India shortly after. Meanwhile, the working classes had neither time nor money for such luxuries. If a maid couldn't sleep, it was chalked up to laziness or poor character. Sleep was a privilege, not a right, and certainly not something to be treated with anything more sophisticated than camphor and shame. And yet, those same women found private forms of comfort. Hidden in garrets and under-the-stairs rooms, they sometimes shared herbal remedies, lavender tea, valerian root, and on rare nights off, tales from the Pearl. Ah yes, the Pearl, a short-lived erotic underground magazine published between 1879 and 1880. It was filthy, it was clever, it was deeply un-Victorian in the best possible way. Distributed in secret, often sewn into the covers of more respectable novels, it offered a rare glimpse into the nocturnal imaginations of both men and women. Some editions included bedtime stories that could never be read aloud, unless you were trying to ensure no one slept that night. And here you are, tossing again, the air thick with silence and unspoken longing. You reach for the bedside table, not for pills or prayer, but maybe for something bound in leather and smuggled past your own censors. A few lines of poetry, a scene you shouldn't reread, a memory you're not supposed to keep. The fire hasn't been lit, but there's a warmth now, not from coals or companionship, but from something inside, a stubborn flicker of yourself, still dreaming, still wide awake. It's now the hour when even the candles seem to sigh. Their wicks droop. The room smells of wax, wool, and whatever that powder is you use to pretend your hair isn't falling out from stress. You lie still under a blanket so starched it could testify in court. The moon spills silvery gilt across the windowsill. You've tried counting sheep. You've tried not thinking about that thing you read in the Pearl. You failed. But here's something odd. You're not alone in this insomnia. Not in this house. Not in this century. The medical men know it. The newspapers whisper about it. And the manufacturers? Oh, they're cashing in. See, sometime around the late 19th century, someone realized that if you can't fix morality, you can at least monetize it. And so begins the golden age of devices designed to help you sleep, or to help you pretend you weren't having entirely normal thoughts. Let's talk about the vibrator again, because yes, it's relevant, and because it became absurdly popular, absurdly fast. Originally developed to treat female hysteria, the electromechanical vibrator entered private homes with the same nonchalance as a tea kettle. By the 1890s, upper-class women were ordering them by mail, sometimes under pseudonyms. One model came with interchangeable heads and looked like a drill crossed with a candlestick. Another was called the Chattanooga and weighed 20 pounds. Romance. And yet no one talked about why these devices worked. Not in public, at least. The language remained euphemistic, soothing, nervous system recalibration, domestic tranquility. If you accidentally achieved satisfaction, well, that was just your womb emptying itself of malaise. Nothing carnal here, folks. Move along. Meanwhile, gentlemen had their own problems, and no gadgets to soften them. Victorian medicine viewed male sexuality as something volatile and dangerous. If a man found himself thinking too much about women, or even just feeling restless after dinner, he might be sent for cooling therapy. This often involved a cold compress to the genitals, sometimes a full bath, and in rare cases, electrical shock. It wasn't as painful as it sounds. It was worse. Historians still argue whether this hysteria over male arousal stemmed from fears of moral decay or from deep-rooted colonial anxiety about self-control. The Victorians were obsessed with domination, of land, of bodies, of urges. So it's no wonder they tried to conquer sleep the same way. And what about sexless marriages? They were everywhere. Companionate unions were quietly encouraged among the educated elite. Marriages built on respect, shared values, and a complete unwillingness to touch each other. One couple in Bath famously maintained separate bedrooms, staircases, and libraries. They lived to their 90s and never once saw each other in night clothes. It was considered wildly successful. But repression always leaks somewhere. Enter the curious case of the nocturnal confession. Some doctors began recording patients who talked in their sleep or wrote in journals by gaslight. The contents were often revealing. A woman who'd never raised her voice in church once scribbled 15 pages of poetic fantasy about her stable boy. A bishop's son confessed in dreams to craving the scent of laundry hanging on her arms. Romantic? Yes. Appropriate? Not in the slightest. And this wasn't isolated. Dream life became a hidden battleground. People feared what they might say or do while unconscious. Whole sermons were delivered about the risks of sinning in slumber, with fire and brimstone warnings about waking up spiritually bankrupt. One quirky method of control? Wearing gloves to bed. Not just to keep warm, but to prevent wandering hands. Some gloves were tied with ribbon, some were sewn shut. Some were made of wool so itchy you couldn't feel pleasure if you tried. And that was the point. According to Kama Sutra, yes, the very one Victorians claimed never to read but secretly adored, touch, scent, and imagination are the three doorways to sleep and sensuality alike. But the British mindset preferred to bolt all three. Still, a few dared to unlock them, particularly the artists and bohemians. In the candlelit studios of Chelsea and the drawing rooms of Bloomsbury, a quiet revolution simmered. Painters spoke in symbols, poets dreamed in metaphors, and some women, braver than most, began to write under pen names. They didn't ask permission to feel things, they simply did. Some even shared their writings at midnight salons, clandestine gatherings where readings were given behind velvet drapes while the housemaids stood lookout. One such gathering, described in Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, involved a group of female writers who read scenes from Indian love poetry while drinking spiced wine and pretending it was medicinal. They wore looser clothing. They left their corsets on hooks, and no one pretended to sleep afterward. It wasn't scandalous. It was human, and quietly, rebelliously restful. Back in your own bedroom, the silence has shifted. The ticking clock no longer feels like a metronome of guilt. It's a pulse. Yours. You're not asleep, but something in you is exhaling. A truth, maybe, or just a memory of someone who once looked at you like you were allowed to feel things. Outside, the sky is still dark, but the edge of dawn is starting to rise, slowly, like a secret. You roll over for the 11th time. Your pillow smells faintly of lavender and antique regret. Somewhere in the house, a pipe groans, a slow, metallic protest of the Victorian plumbing system, which, like your libido, is both outdated and deeply misunderstood. Sleep remains evasive. And now you begin to wonder, is this just fatigue? Or have you become a full-fledged character in a serialized medical melodrama? Because if you're a gentleman in the late 19th century and you can't sleep, the world assumes something is very wrong with your essence. Yes, your essence. Welcome to the world of seminal economy, where a man's physical and moral strength is thought to depend on not wasting his vital fluids. And sleep? Sleep was when the body could betray you. Doctors were particularly alarmed by nocturnal emissions. These were referred to, without a trace of humor, as the night sins. Medical texts warned that spontaneous release of semen during sleep could cause everything from lethargy to baldness to full-blown madness. Some even blamed insomnia on previous emissions, creating a sort of chicken and egg of guilt and sleeplessness. Enter the bizarre solutions. One method, popular among anxious clergy and Latin students, was to wear a chastity device to bed. Not the iron kind from cartoons. These were cloth bands tied around the thighs, or in more extreme cases, small cages of wire designed to remind the body of its dignity, gentle, horrifying dignity. Another involved the use of a cold ceramic ring, chilled in a basin of water beside the bed and slipped on just before turning in. The idea was to reduce arousal through temperature. It mostly reduced circulation and caused nightmares about glaciers. Historians still argue whether these treatments were sincere attempts at wellness or just symptoms of national neurosis, likely both. But what's clear is that Victorian men feared their own bodies. Sleep wasn't sanctuary, it was a trap door into temptation. To make matters worse, many upper-class men suffered from something now called performance insomnia, not just in bed but in society at large. They were expected to be decisive at breakfast, philosophical by lunch, and unflinchingly rational at dinner. And of course, completely uninterested in anything as vulgar as touch after sunset. But reality has a way of disrupting even the most tailored lives. Let's take a look at a curious case buried in an 1895 ledger of a private men's clinic in Edinburgh. One patient, a banker, claimed to be haunted by erotic dreams of perfectly symmetrical women whose ankles foretold ruin. He insisted they were not people he knew, but rather symbols of inflationary anxiety. The physician recommended a strict diet of boiled potatoes, no books, and solitary walks in drizzle. This worked for 3 days, until the patient developed a strong romantic fixation on his umbrella. And what about bachelors? Oh, they were particularly suspicious. Unmarried men past 30 were quietly assumed to be either broken, criminally devoted to their mothers, or deeply secretive about their nightly activities. If they had trouble sleeping, it was whispered they might be reading foreign novels, or worse, journaling about dreams. Self-reflection was considered perilous after dusk. A peculiar device even emerged around 1880 called the nocturnal monitor. It was a small mechanical alarm fastened beneath one's nightshirt, designed to wake the wearer upon any pelvic movement. The marketing copy promised peace of mind through interruption. Spoiler, it mostly caused bruising and humiliation. But there were exceptions. A few men, usually poets, painters, or scandalously French, began to reject the stiff-collar doctrine of repression. They explored ideas about eroticism as part of sleep, not in opposition to it. Take, for instance, the writings of Paul Verlaine, whose verses flirted openly with desire and dreams. While not technically Victorian in his homeland, his works were smuggled into English salons by the rebellious few. One London bookseller reportedly kept copies under floorboards, accessible only to trusted customers who asked for the wine list. In those pages, sleeplessness wasn't a curse, it was an invitation. Peter Webb, in The Erotic Spirit Through History, describes how these alternative thinkers viewed arousal not as a hindrance to sleep, but a threshold to it. Desire, when acknowledged rather than repressed, could soften the mind, lull the body, and lead into the gentle haze of rest. They called it the velvet descent. Contrast that with the mainstream Victorian man, lying awake on a horsehair mattress, trying to think about crumpets and avoiding eye contact with his own knees. The tension between bodily need and cultural expectation was brutal, but beneath it, a quiet resistance stirred. Some began reading Eastern texts, not just for their exotic appeal, but for their gentler approach to intimacy. Translations of the Kama Sutra began to circulate, at first in coded fragments. These editions were often accompanied by long, nervous introductions apologizing for their contents, followed by surprisingly tender passages about connection, rhythm, and yes, sleep. One merchant reportedly memorized entire verses from the Kama Sutra as a nighttime meditation. He claimed it cured his insomnia. His wife claimed it cured their marriage. The lesson? Maybe peace doesn't come from silence or suppression, but from being honest with your own breath, your own rhythm. Outside, the night is deep now. The last tram has rattled home. Your eyes are heavier, but your mind is still tracing old roads, lace cuffs, velvet dreams, forbidden verses. Maybe you're not tired. Maybe you're just waiting to stop pretending. It's cold now. That particular type of late-night chill that seeps into your toes, despite the fireplace and the extra quilt you insisted on. Your breath fogs slightly in the air. You tug the blanket tighter, but sleep still slips away like an untrustworthy valet. If you were a proper Victorian lady, this is when your nighttime routine would begin. Because contrary to modern assumptions, Victorian women did not just brush their hair 100 times and drift off in silence. No, bedtime was an event, a ritual draped in lace, talcum, camphor, and a kind of ceremonial exhaustion. First, the corset. You wouldn't sleep in one unless you were trying to preserve your waist in preparation for a ball or your third cousin's proposal. But even after unlacing, the rib cage remembered. Women often complained of chest tightness, backache, and yes, insomnia. One physician called it phantom pressure. Another, more dramatic one, referred to it as the memory of social duty upon the flesh, which is a fancy way of saying it still hurts when it's gone. Next came the powders and oils, lavender water for the pillow, rose oil for the temples, a dab of camphor under the nose to purify air and desire. Some even rubbed their earlobes with peppermint to stimulate healthy thoughts. Historians still argue whether this did anything at all, but peppermint ears became strangely fashionable for a few seasons. Then came the tonic. Chloral hydrate, introduced in the 1830s, had become a staple by the mid-century. It was called the modern laudanum. Strong, fast, and just legal enough to be respectable. Mixed with brandy or warm milk, it took the edge off. Too much, though, and you'd wake up mid-dream thinking you were floating above your own diary. There's one story from a Mayfair apothecary involving a certain Lady H, known for her dinner parties and her passive-aggressive embroidery. She became addicted to chloral after years of night sweats and marital fatigue. Her maid reported she would drift off muttering poetry about horses and forbidden kisses. She once attempted to seduce a taxidermied owl. But Lady H was not unusual. Victorian women were balancing impossible expectations: to be pure but pleasing, quiet but clever, restful yet ever alert to a husband's midnight approach. Sleep, if it came, was a battlefield victory, and some women started to resent the war. Enter the confession letters. These were unsent notes, written in the deep of night by candle or weak lamp. Often folded into diaries or slipped into the back of Bible pages, they reveal a startling truth. Victorian women were not repressed. They were restricted, and their minds never stopped working. One woman wrote about dreams of her piano tutor who smelled of ink and citrus and never once looked at her ankles. Another confessed that the only way she could fall asleep was to imagine herself as a pirate, covered in tattoos, kissing someone entirely inappropriate in the hold of a stolen ship. You begin to notice something. These nighttime thoughts, these so-called symptoms, they weren't deranged. They were vivid, creative, human. But because they didn't fit the model of a compliant, pious sleeper, they were pathologized. Even Queen Victoria, so often the symbol of prudery, was rumored to have nighttime passions. Her diaries, heavily redacted, hint at a deep physical affection for Prince Albert. After his death, she wore black every day, but she also kept a cast of his hand by her bedside. Some say she would hold it as she drifted into restless sleep. Historians still argue whether her mourning was more romantic than sensual. But the point remains. She grieved through touch and memory. And now we arrive at the bedtime confession you never planned on. Because you, too, have been wandering through thoughts you don't usually say aloud. A flash of an old lover's name. The curious weight of longing. The friction between desire and decorum. You don't need chloral hydrate to feel a little dizzy. Just honesty. Let's not forget the role of noise again, the thing that got this whole insomnia spiral started. In many middle-class homes, bedrooms weren't isolated. They shared walls, pipes, even servants' passageways. You might hear someone snore, mutter, or worse, speak clearly in their dreams. One governess wrote that she heard her employer's wife sobbing into a pillow every Thursday night at exactly 11:15. She never asked why. She simply started playing the piano louder on Wednesdays. This interconnectedness meant privacy was an illusion, so nighttime became a silent rebellion. If you couldn't speak freely by day, you could at least think wildly by night. And yet the remedies persisted. Some women tried sleeping facing east to align with the moon. Others read Shakespeare aloud to the mirror, hoping to calm the humors. A particularly creative group in Glasgow believed that placing a lock of hair under the mattress bound your thoughts to the body. The logic? If your thoughts wandered too far, sleep couldn't find you. A bit like now, isn't it? The fire's out again, your body's heavy, but your mind, the very thing they tried to silence, is just waking up. Somewhere beneath the layers of quilt and quiet frustration, you're starting to feel it. That edge of madness particular to the chronically underslept. Your limbs ache, your thoughts loop, and the silence has begun to sound like a sermon. You consider reciting poetry. You consider reciting laundry lists. You consider calling your maid and asking her to slap you with a lavender sachet. Anything. But tonight, the only cure available is distraction. And nothing distracts quite like forbidden literature. We must now speak of the books Victorians weren't supposed to read, but absolutely did. Hidden behind curtains, beneath loose floorboards, or bound in misleading covers, the decline of Roman agriculture was a popular disguise. Erotic novels circulated among the sleepless like whispered magic. Some were imported, some were handwritten. All were very much illegal. The most famous, as you might expect, is Fanny Hill, a book that had more public trials than most Victorian criminals. But by the 1860s, new contenders emerged, quietly printed in France or Germany and smuggled into England inside crates labeled scientific optics. The most enduring among them? The Pearl. Ah yes, the Pearl. A monthly Victorian erotic journal published anonymously between 1879 and 1880. Each issue was a buffet of forbidden delicacies, short stories, bawdy poems, naughty limericks, and even pretend medical advice. Despite its explicit content, it was written with surprising wit and literary flair. In many cases, it was cleverer than the novels considered respectable. One curious installment involved a woman who couldn't sleep unless her bed was sprinkled with rose petals and the gardener read her Don Juan in a bad French accent. Another featured a man who claimed to dream more vividly after sniffing a corset. These weren't just smutty tales, they were coping mechanisms, lullabies for the emotionally repressed. Historians still argue whether readers of the Pearl saw it as escapism or education. Some passages veer into the realm of fantasy, others, alarmingly, reflect real frustrations. The common thread? People wanted connection, and they couldn't say so aloud. Even more fascinating were the readers. Many subscribers were women, middle class, educated, and quietly rebellious. They read under quilts by firelight, pretending they were studying Greek or reviewing hymnals. Some marked passages, some memorized them. One diary entry from a Vicar's daughter includes the note, Volume 3, P17, reminds me of Mr. S.'s hands. Must not reread. Reread twice. If the upper classes feared scandal, the middle classes feared discovery. The shame wasn't in the desire, it was in the proof of it. Books, after all, could be found, burned, reported. You couldn't unburn desire. But still they read. Some even wrote. Anonymous letters to underground presses began to appear. Confessions, fantasies, advice. A few ended up reprinted in publications like The Cremorne, a short-lived sensual review named after a pleasure garden in Chelsea. These contributions were from governesses, widows, artists, models, people who weren't supposed to have imaginations at bedtime, much less articulate ones. And while the Pearl was eventually shut down, its readers didn't forget it. Copies were hoarded, passed down, even rebound in misleading covers. One woman reportedly disguised hers as a recipe book titled Soups of the Empire. That's dedication. This literary rebellion was not just about lust, it was about reclaiming the night. You see, Victorians were not as sexually clueless as stereotypes suggest. They were, however, deeply conflicted. Intimacy was celebrated in private and condemned in public. The bedroom was both a sanctuary and a courtroom. And books, those paper lifelines, became quiet co-conspirators in the war against insomnia. Take, for example, a curious story from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings. One aristocratic mistress of the French court, though just pre-Victorian in date, very much on brand in spirit, kept a stash of erotic letters beneath her pillow. She claimed she couldn't fall asleep without reading one, even if it made her weep. She once told her chambermaid, "Sleep only finds me after I've remembered being wanted." Whether it's fact or embellished memory, the sentiment lingers. And so as you lie there, restless, tangled in half-finished thoughts and unfinished dreams, you wonder, what would you write in your own pearl-like confession? Would it be a fantasy, a regret, a whispered name you haven't said aloud in years? Or maybe, like many Victorians, you wouldn't write at all. You'd simply lie still and let the thoughts play out in images, each one too scandalous to keep, too comforting to banish. The fire has died again. The house is still. You reach for a book that doesn't exist, one that would understand, forgive, and rock you gently into sleep. Instead, you find yourself with this story. Not quite Fanny Hill, but oddly familiar. And if you drift off now, half listening, half remembering, no one will know what thoughts you take with you into the dark. It's nearly morning. You haven't noticed the sky yet, but the room feels different. The kind of stillness that only comes after hours of tension. The sort of silence that hums, not because it's empty, but because it's full of things unsaid. You're still not asleep, but you're not quite awake either, which is, in many ways, exactly how Queen Victoria liked it. Yes, let's talk about her. So much is said about Victoria the monarch. Less about Victoria the woman who, by all accounts, managed to sleep deeply and regularly. No hysteria, no visible insomnia, no reports of sleepwalking or reciting poetry to owls. How? Why did she sleep while her subjects tossed and turned through decades of corseted anxiety? Well, let's peek behind the palace curtains. To begin, Queen Victoria kept an astonishingly rigid bedtime routine. Her chambers were heavily managed, with lighting dimmed 2 hours before rest, and absolute silence enforced by a small army of staff. Her dogs, yes, she had many, were taught not to bark at night. Her nightgowns were made from soft muslin, scented with bergamot and cedar oil. She had a dedicated lady-in-waiting, whose only task after 9 p.m. was to make sure no one anywhere in the wing disturbed the sovereign's sleep. If a window creaked, someone was replaced. Still, it wasn't just the peace and quiet that lulled her. It was Albert. Historians still argue whether Queen Victoria's marriage was one of deep passion or carefully staged affection. But her diaries, particularly before they were redacted, suggest a level of physical and emotional intimacy that defied the era's expectations. She adored him, not just politically or as a partner in rule, but as a man. She writes of his dear hands, his tender smile, and once, rather boldly, his divine shoulders. In one entry, she refers to a sweet rest following our embrace, and goes on to describe the peaceful sleep that followed. The implication is clear. For Victoria, sleep was not hindered by intimacy. It was enhanced by it. Eleanor Herman writes that Victoria's affection for Albert was so intense, it caused minor scandal among palace staff. She would write to him while he was away, requesting earlier bedtimes upon his return. One note, discovered in an archive, simply reads, "Let us not delay our comforts." Scandalous? Maybe. Honest? Absolutely. And what happened after Albert died? The sleep vanished. For years following his death in 1861, Victoria suffered from chronic insomnia. She described her nights as heavy with absence and complained of a coldness in the bed no fire can mend. She continued to sleep beside his image, literally. His dressing gown remained on a nearby chair. His shaving bowl was refilled every morning. Her nightly routine included kissing his photograph before she lay down. Some medical advisors suggested she sleep in another room. She refused. Others recommended she increase her chloral dosage. She resisted until the dreams became unbearable. Eventually, she began to sleep again. Not as deeply, not as often, but enough. Because even in mourning, she maintained rituals, structure, scent, touch, and memory, if not in body. Perhaps the real secret to her rest wasn't power or privilege, but consistency and devotion. Compare this to the average Victorian woman, fumbling with a candlestick and a half-closed novel, unsure whether she's supposed to be tired, aroused, guilty, or all three. And it's not just women. Men idolized Victoria's control, but envied Albert's apparent peace. After all, here was a man who lived in the center of an empire, fathered 9 children, and still had time to invent a comfortable sleeping shirt. No, really. Prince Albert was obsessed with textiles. His nightwear was the envy of European courts, soft, breathable, and most importantly, non-binding. Some say he once asked a tailor to invent a collar for sleep that does not remind one of Parliament. Legend or not, the message was clear. He wanted to sleep, not debate. But perhaps the most striking thing about Victoria and Albert's relationship is how modern it feels. 2 people negotiating life, love, and sleep under the weight of constant scrutiny. Their bedroom wasn't just a chamber, it was a sanctuary, albeit a heavily embroidered one. One lesser-known fact, Albert believed in co-sleeping. At a time when many aristocratic couples maintained separate rooms, he and Victoria insisted on sharing a bed. He called it the only honest part of our day. So maybe that's what we've lost, and what the Victorians feared. The honesty of night, the way the body tells truths, the mouth cannot. Peter Webb calls it the final hour of the self, that liminal space where pretense drops and what's left is simply breath, warmth, and perhaps the echo of someone else's. You look at your bed now, it's not a royal chamber. There's no footman waiting, no love letters tucked under the pillow. But you understand, perhaps, what Queen Victoria felt in those moments between breath and sleep, that the night is kinder when shared, even if only in memory. And with that, you sink a little deeper into the mattress. Still not asleep, but closer. The bed is warm now, not because the fire has revived. It's long gone. Not because of the blanket, though it's draped properly, tucked like a governess's scolding. No, the warmth comes from the stories, from the sheer absurdity and tenderness of what you've wandered through tonight. And yet, we've only just unlocked one of the darker corners of Victorian sleep, the place where restlessness became a medical offense. You're about to visit the asylum. Yes, Victorian England, in all its charitable brilliance, decided that too much nighttime imagination could mean madness. And once doctors began diagnosing hysteria and night unrest as signs of deeper moral failings, they needed somewhere to put those who refused to get better by drinking valerian and pretending to enjoy their marriage. Enter the lunatic asylum. Now, don't imagine a terrifying, cobweb-filled tower, though some of them were disturbingly drafty. Many Victorian asylums were carefully designed to look like country estates, complete with gardens, clock towers, and confusingly pleasant wallpaper. But inside? Oh, inside was a different story. Patients were admitted for all kinds of reasons, but for women, the most common? Insomnia, linked to sexual anxiety. It went like this. A woman complained of sleeplessness. The doctor asked probing questions. If she revealed that she felt haunted by thoughts or unsettled by desire, she could be deemed unstable. Too many mentions of dreams or unexplained weeping, and suddenly she was headed for therapeutic isolation. Sometimes she went voluntarily, sometimes not. One famous case from 1878 involved a woman named Eleanor, age 31, who reportedly spoke of longing while lighting the hearth and was sent to the Norfolk County Asylum after 4 sleepless weeks. Her letters, later published anonymously, reveal a quiet mind, an aching body, and a desperate desire to be left alone with her books. She was released years later with no official diagnosis. Her crime had been feeling too much. Historians still argue whether asylums were meant to protect society from patients or patients from society. For men, the story was different, but no less unsettling. A sleepless man was considered unmanned, and too many nights without rest implied dissipation, or more scandalously, invisible indulgence. If he admitted to frequent arousal, especially without a wife to take care of it, doctors might suggest institutional observation. One man in Yorkshire was committed after saying he felt thunder in his bones each time he lay down. The thunder was, of course, coded. Institutions began keeping what they called lust logs. Yes, that's real. These were nightly charts recording patient agitation, dreams, self-touching, and whispered confessions. Nurses, usually underpaid and emotionally numb, would observe from the hallway and mark behaviors like moaning or disturbed by pillow friction. The phrasing was clinical. The implications were ridiculous. One peculiar patient, listed only as Mr. G, reportedly tore his bedding into heart shapes and stuffed them into the fireplace. When asked why, he said, "To remove her from my mind." Her identity was never recorded. The treatments offered in these institutions were a cocktail of contradiction. Cold baths, long walks, in some places water dousing, essentially polite hosing. There were also rest cures, where a patient would be fed milk and forcibly confined to bed for weeks, forbidden from reading, writing, or talking. The idea was that overactive minds led to overactive morals. But perhaps the most ironic aspect, many patients slept better in the asylum. Not because the walls were welcoming, but because for the first time, they were allowed to be tired. No chores, no forced dinner talk, no pretenses, just a bed, a window, and time to unravel the thoughts that had been locked away. Peter Webb recounts the story of a young woman named Annabelle, who entered a Devon asylum after a public sleepwalking episode in which she reportedly tried to kiss a statue. When asked why, she replied, "Because it stayed still and listened." After 3 weeks in silence, she began to sleep again. Not deeply, not dreamlessly, but enough. The question remains, were these people mad, or were they simply denied the tools for rest? There's a line in the history of sexuality that comes to mind. Where silence is demanded, confession becomes rebellion. The Victorians, for all their lace and liturgy, feared what night might reveal, so they locked it up, diagnosed it, institutionalized it, and yet the dreams didn't stop. Even in the asylums, patients were observed murmuring names, stroking their own arms, whispering poetry to the ceiling. One doctor noted that despite sedatives and isolation, the erotic continues to haunt the unconscious, which is a very fancy way of saying you can't drug away desire, nor should you. Back in your bed, you feel that hum again, that pull at the edge of consciousness where imagination lives. It's not madness, it's memory, want, curiosity, all the things that make us human, and ironically capable of sleep. The room is darker now, quieter, safer, and you, still sleepless but softer, wonder what dreams might come if you stop fearing them. It's the hour of almost sleep. That dreamy no man's land between the third and fourth time you fluff the pillow and the moment your brain starts composing sonnets about the wallpaper. You're still awake, of course, but there's a fuzziness settling in. And that's good, because now we arrive at the strangest chapter of all, the Victorians' obsession with dreams and what they meant. Let's be clear, Victorians weren't casual about dreaming. They cataloged them, moralized them, feared them, and most importantly, believed they were coded messages from somewhere deeper. The body, the soul, the repressed psyche, depends on the dream book you owned. By the 1860s, dream interpretation had become a full-blown cottage industry. There were pamphlets, pocket guides, and even parlor manuals of dream symbols. Did you dream of lace? That meant deception. Of fire, passion, or damnation, depending on the tone. Of a man with a beard offering you grapes? Either an inheritance was coming, or you really needed to talk to someone. One of the best-selling dream manuals of the era was Zadkiel's Dream Book, a mysterious volume attributed to an astrologer who wore velvet trousers and once tried to patent a star-shaped barometer. It offered over 1,000 entries, all with moral undertones. Dreaming of nudity? Guilt. Dreaming of flying? Ambition. Dreaming of touching someone's hand in moonlight? Scandal. Also possibly a sign you needed to change your diet. But where the manuals tiptoed around lust, real people did not. The Victorians dreamt about sex constantly. Of course, they couldn't say that. Not directly. Instead, dreams were couched in metaphors. Damp staircases, bursting flower beds, horses that could not be tamed. But everyone knew what was going on. Dream logs kept by doctors and sleep institutes, yes, those existed, are full of phrases like, felt great heat behind the eyes, and desired closeness to a stranger with nice boots. One widely circulated private letter describes a woman who claimed to dream nightly of lying on a beach with someone unnameable who smells of oranges. She swore she'd never met him. Her husband, understandably, did not appreciate the detail. This erotic dreaming was especially common among the sleep-deprived. Historians still debate whether it was a cause or a side effect. Did people dream more vividly because they couldn't sleep properly? Or were they kept awake by what they feared they might see behind their eyelids? Let's not forget, Victorian society believed dreams were moral reflections. So if you dreamt about something you shouldn't want, that was taken very seriously. You might be advised to confess it to your priest, or worse, your physician. And that rarely went well. In one infamous case, a woman in Oxford reported recurring dreams of embracing her schoolmistress. She sought medical advice. The doctor told her to avoid cheese and wear tighter stays. She died unmarried at 76, but left behind volumes of dream poetry that were only recently published, and they are steamy. Men, too, confessed odd dreams. One diary recounts a judge who, after 20 years on the bench, began dreaming that he was a washerwoman, surrounded by buckets and long, wet things. He was disturbed. His physician was perplexed. His wife reportedly thought it was hilarious. Of course, the most iconic dreamer of this period never lived in England, Sigmund Freud. But his ideas didn't fully reach Britain until after Victoria's death. Before Freud, dreams were moral, not psychological. But after Freud, dreams were drenched in repression and still misunderstood. Peter Webb notes that many of the erotic dreams recorded in the 1880s and 90s reveal not just desire, but loneliness. A hunger for warmth, for connection, for comfort. The kind of yearning that no tonic, prayer, or lace-trimmed journal could soothe. Which brings us back to the Victorian bedroom. Imagine this. You, under 3 blankets, face turned away from your partner because to roll over and look at them might imply too much. You've said your prayers. You've tucked your feet just so. But your mind is a riot. You think of someone from the market, the way their sleeve brushed yours, the way they laughed. You imagine them saying your name, not loudly, but as if it were a secret. You don't move. You don't speak. You barely breathe. But there it is, the dream before the dream. And in that moment, you are more awake than ever. One quirky case from a sleep institute near Bristol tells of a patient who began talking in her sleep every night at precisely 2:13 a.m. She would whisper names, first names, common ones, James, Clara, Thomas. But eventually she started reciting lines of poetry, original ones. One nurse recorded them in a notebook. They were oddly good. When asked if she remembered, the patient said, "No, but I feel better." There is perhaps a lesson in that. Dreams don't always need to be understood. Sometimes they just need to be allowed. And as your own thoughts begin to blur, you realize that maybe tonight's rest won't be textbook. You might not dream of beaches or oranges, but maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself walking slowly through a garden, barefoot, past statues that blush and fountains that whisper things you're not supposed to say aloud. And if that's not restful, what is? The first birds haven't started yet, but the night feels thinner now. Not quieter, just stretched, like taffeta pulled tight across a too-wide hoop skirt. You're floating somewhere between thought and non-thought, that curious drift state where your limbs forget they're supposed to do anything at all. And this, oddly enough, is where we meet the most exhausted souls of the Victorian world, the sleepless men in nightgowns crying softly into lace-edged pillows. It sounds dramatic, yes, but for many Victorian men, especially those caught between duty and desire, insomnia was a kind of personal apocalypse. Sleep was a virtue. Sleep meant strength. To lie awake night after night meant something in you was breaking. And yet they couldn't say why. Because no man in 1864 could walk into his club, clutch his cravat, and declare, "Good heavens, Jenkins, I fear I'm being emotionally dismantled by my own unmet affection." Instead, they called it neural strain, or mental collapse, or, if they were particularly literary, a withering of constitution. Historians still argue whether Victorian men truly lacked emotional vocabulary, or whether society simply refused to let them use it. The truth probably lies, as usual, somewhere under a stack of unpaid correspondence and a faint smell of pipe smoke. What's certain is this: many of them broke down, quietly, elegantly, tragically. Let's take Mr. B, a barrister from Bloomsbury whose diaries were discovered decades later, hidden behind a false wall in his townhouse. Each entry is detailed, formal, and devastating. He writes of waking at 2:40 a.m., heart pounding, the room thick with dreams I never dared dream. He describes longing, for what, he never says, and insomnia so bad he considered traveling to India for the silence. His final entry, "I miss him even in the places we never were." We don't know who him is, but we know what Mr. B was missing: a place to be whole. This wasn't rare. Men, especially those unmarried or in artistic professions, often live double lives, one of cigars and card games, and one of unspoken craving. Many shared houses with male friends well into their 40s, writing poetry that hovered just on the edge of confession. Some slept two to a bed, citing economy. Some didn't bother with reasons. And in the dark, behind closed curtains, many of them wept. Peter Webb refers to this as the nocturnal grief of the respectable male, an ache for connection that could only be expressed when the world went quiet. These men were taught that touch was weakness, that affection belonged in the nursery, not the study. So it emerged sideways, through letters, shared tea, long walks, and yes, sleepless nights. But it wasn't always sadness. Sometimes it was just restlessness. One letter, published anonymously in a periodical called The Moral Observer, described a man who could not sleep unless he imagined a warm presence beside him, whose voice I may never hear, but whose breath I recognize. He called it a phantom cure. The editor dismissed it as nonsense, but readers responded, quietly, gratefully. One even wrote back, "I too have a phantom. We never speak, but I sleep better when he's imagined there." Of course, the institutions didn't help. Doctors suggested horseback riding, long walks in inclement weather, or strict diets of dry toast and cold ham. Emotional expression? Absolutely not. Tears were considered a draining of the moral humors. One well-meaning physician advised, "When tears threaten, simply clench your jaw and recite Latin." One wonders how many men lay in bed at 3 a.m., clenched and conjugating, waiting for silence to become stillness. And here's a curious aside. Victorian nightwear for men was surprisingly tender. Long nightshirts, often embroidered, slippers with velvet trim, nightcaps so elaborate they looked like theatrical props. The idea was comfort cloaked in dignity. But when the house was quiet and the gas lights were dimmed, these garments transformed. They became symbols of softness, of a life permitted only between the hours of midnight and dawn. One eccentric nobleman, the Earl of C, was known for hosting silent suppers in the dead of night, where guests arrived in nightgowns, sat on cushions, and ate stewed fruit by candlelight. No one spoke, no one judged, and everyone reportedly slept better after. It's hard to say whether he was a visionary or just lonely, but perhaps it doesn't matter, because what he offered, and what most Victorian men lacked, was permission. Permission to be tired, to be tender, to not always perform, and maybe, just maybe, to admit that they wanted to be held, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally, in the cold. On a Tuesday, at 4 a.m., back in your room, you shift slightly. The blanket slips, your chest rises, falls. There's something oddly soothing about knowing that somewhere 150 years ago, another man was lying awake, heart full, eyes open, wishing he could say out loud what he whispered to the dark. You may not sleep just yet, but you are not alone. There's a soft creak just now, the sound of old floorboards settling, or maybe the past stretching its joints. Either way, you don't move. You're too deep into that drowsy space where time feels slow and curious, where history isn't something you study, it's something you inhabit. And tonight, you're about to step into the smokiest, most sensual corner of the Victorian night, the opium den. Let's be clear, Victorians didn't talk about drugs the way we do now. They didn't have Netflix documentaries or wellness blogs, but they did have chronic insomnia, colonial connections, and a burgeoning black market for substances that blurred the line between dream and wakefulness. And nothing blurred it better than opium. By the 1850s, opium was the sleep aid of choice for the urban elite, the poetic misfits, and the quietly desperate. It came in many forms: pills, tinctures, syrups, but the most infamous was laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium that could be bought over the counter without so much as a raised eyebrow. Parents gave it to teething infants. Artists drank it like wine. And insomniacs, they clutched it like salvation. But for those who truly wanted to dissolve into oblivion, there were the dens, low-lit rooms in the seedier parts of London or Liverpool, perfumed with smoke, filled with reclining bodies and silence thick as velvet. Contrary to popular imagination, these weren't always squalid. Some were draped with Eastern fabrics, their clientele a strange blend of Chinese immigrants, society dropouts, and upper-class thrill-seekers slumming their way toward stillness. One notable case from 1882 involves a widow, known only as Mrs. D, who visited an East End den 3 nights a week. She claimed she couldn't sleep unless she floated first, and described the experience as melting into myself and coming out elsewhere. Her doctor, predictably horrified, prescribed prayer and beef broth. She ignored him. These dens were less about addiction than escape. At least at first, they were places where the mind could unbutton itself, where dreams came uninvited, and no one asked what you were trying to forget. Historians still argue whether the rise of opium use was purely recreational or a cultural rebellion against Victorian rigidity. It may have been both. For many, especially women trapped in quiet households, the den offered something no drawing room could: anonymity and acceptance. You could lie back, sigh, and not be expected to perform anything. Not femininity, not virtue, not even consciousness. Of course, not everyone indulged in dens. Many preferred to stay home and sip their laudanum quietly in a floral teacup. One recipe for a sleep cordial included milk, cinnamon, and precisely 12 drops of tincture. Another added a spoonful of brandy and a passage from the Psalms for moral clarity. Let's not forget the writers. Charles Dickens, never one to miss a trend, wrote vividly about opium in his later novels. Thomas de Quincey penned Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a bestseller that made addiction sound like a poetic rite of passage. And Wilkie Collins, plagued by gout and ghosts of his own, depended on laudanum so thoroughly he sometimes forgot what year it was while writing. But the most curious part? None of them described it as purely indulgent. They called it rest, softening, relief from the grind of thought. These were men too brilliant to sleep and too haunted not to crave it. And where there's craving, there's sex. Yes, opium didn't just knock people out, it opened them up. Quietly, subtly. It dulled inhibition and untied the laces of shame. Many who used it before bed reported not just vivid dreams, but physical longing within them. One artist wrote that after a pipe, he dreamt of satin wrists and voices like perfume. Another claimed to feel loved by shadows. Poetic? Yes. Sleepless? Absolutely not. Peter Webb notes in The Erotic Spirit Through History that many cultures used intoxicants to prepare for erotic or spiritual dreams. The Victorians, despite their denials, were simply late to the party. Their dens weren't new. They were echoes of ancient rituals disguised in soot and lace. One fringe theory at the time was that opium allowed soul travel, that during sleep the body remained behind while the soul visited realms where touch was taboo. You could kiss without sin. You could love without law. You could rest without explanation. This belief, half medical, half mystical, persisted quietly among night lovers, especially those who had no other outlet. Unmarried women, artists, clerks too shy to flirt. Opium let them feel in a world that demanded they perform numbness. Of course, it wasn't sustainable. Addiction followed. So did decline. By the 1890s, reformers were closing dens, pamphleteers were shrieking about moral decay, and laudanum began slipping from polite conversation. But for a while, for a precious few decades, the Victorian night had a secret passage. And maybe, just maybe, that passage still lingers. Not as a pipe or a tonic, but as a reminder that rest doesn't always come through discipline. Sometimes it arrives through surrender, through softness, through letting go of the stiffness your world insists upon. Outside your window, the dark is less absolute. The air has shifted. Maybe sleep is waiting, not in the silence, but in the stories you let yourself remember. The air has cooled, not in temperature, but in tone. The hush that now sits in your bedroom isn't just quiet, it's contemplative. Your body's heavier, your eyes slower to blink, but your brain, ever the Victorian, still clings to rules. So let's talk about the most hysterically over-policed bedtime offense of all, masturbation. Yes, the moral epidemic of the age, the invisible threat, the unnameable thing that could turn your spine to soup and your soul to ash, according to 19th century medical wisdom, of course. If you were a Victorian parent and your child couldn't sleep, one of the first culprits you were told to consider wasn't nightmares or too much treacle pudding. No, it was self-abuse. That was the term. And it was everywhere. Pamphlets, sermons, medical texts, all united in one obsessive campaign, preventing people from touching themselves, especially in bed, especially if they wanted to. Michel Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, explores how this peculiar blend of scientific paranoia and religious dread converged to create a moral surveillance state. Bedrooms became crime scenes, dreams became evidence. And sleep was dangerous because it's when the will sleeps too. So how did this moral panic express itself? With products, so many products. There were anti-masturbation gloves, spiked, padded, buttoned. Some were designed to tie the hands together, like lace-bound hostage gear. Others had bells sewn into the cuffs, so if you moved too much, the household would know. Nothing says restful slumber like jingling shame. One particularly grim invention was the nighttime purity sheet, a stiff canvas overlay that prevented the body from making contact with itself. It was fastened with straps under the mattress and astonishingly came in floral prints. For the feminine mind, one ad assured. Children too were targeted. Boys' sleepwear was altered to make access difficult, and special undergarments were sewn with uncomfortable seams. Some manuals advised placing books on the chest during sleep to remind the mind of duty. If you had to sleep with a sibling, a pillow was placed between you like the angel Gabriel's arm. And the language. Oh, the language. Manuals never said penis or genitals. They referred to the organs, the region, or more melodramatically, the site of sin. The pamphlets had titles like The Silent Ruin, Youth in the Grave, or The Enemy Within. You could wallpaper your room with their paranoia. One real publication from 1857 warned, every drop lost is a drop of future vigor. Another insisted that nighttime emissions were akin to hemorrhage, only more moral in consequence. And yet, everyone knew it was nonsense. Secretly, quietly, people joked, whispered, shared tips. One group of Cambridge students created a code of hand signals to discuss their success or failure in avoiding the impulse. Another left sticky notes, literally and figuratively in library books, rating pamphlets on their absurdity. There's a tale, possibly apocryphal but irresistible, of a bishop's son who wrote an entire erotic novella disguised as a theological treatise on purity. It circulated among choir boys under the title Psalm 69. Women, too, were not spared. While hysteria treatments often involved medical stimulation, female masturbation outside the doctor's office was strictly condemned. It excites the nerves, warned one gynecologist. It hollows the eyes. It dries the soul. Peter Webb counters this Victorian fear with a much gentler insight. Private pleasure was not a betrayal of society. It was a conversation with the self. But try explaining that to a woman wearing 3 layers of wool flannel and being told to sleep with her hands crossed over her chest like a corpse. Still, some resisted. A woman named Clara, aged 24, wrote in her diary, "They say to never touch, to never dream, but if I do not own this body at night, when can I?" Her journal was discovered long after her death, hidden in a box of ribbons. The pages are filled with shame, yes, but also curiosity, tenderness, even delight. And for those without words, there were dreams. The dreams, again, did not behave. Victorians reported nocturnal sins with increasing panic. One physician logged over 200 patients who admitted to dreams of embrace, of damp closeness, of scandalous calm. That last one stuck with me. Scandalous calm. Imagine needing to confess that your subconscious felt peaceful. The treatments, as ever, were elaborate. Cold compresses, sleeping on hard boards, drinking vinegar before bed. One pamphlet even suggested placing a Bible under the pillow and a potato in each sock to ground the lust. And yet people continued to sleep with their thoughts. Some resisted the panic. Some internalized it. Some wrote poetry. Some wrote nothing at all, but stared at the ceiling, blinking in the darkness, hoping their body would behave. Back in your own room, you shift again. A hand resting on your chest, not out of shame, but instinct. Comfort. Presence. You're not in danger. You're not being watched by pamphleteers or purity guardians. Your body is yours. Your thoughts are yours. And sleep? It comes when you stop apologizing for being alive. The night is thick again, quiet, heavy, forgiving. You're lying still now. Not asleep, but no longer entirely awake. It's that blissfully fuzzy zone where your thoughts are slow, your limbs warm, and the absurdity of everything starts to feel oddly reasonable, which is a perfect mindset for our next stop, the tragic-comic tale of Victorian beds. Not the sleep itself, but the beds. Because for a society so panicked about sex, the Victorians designed some very suggestive furniture. Let's start with the sheer grandeur of it all. Victorian beds weren't just beds. They were status statements, moral fortresses, and often architectural hazards. The wealthier your family, the more likely your bed resembled an altar. Carved mahogany pillars, canopies so thick they blocked the moonlight, and mattresses that required at least 3 servants to rotate. One London couple had a custom-made 4-poster with a brass railing to prevent falling into error. The error was never defined. But here's the strange thing. Despite the splendor, many of these beds weren't actually used for sleeping together. In upper-class homes, it became fashionable for married couples to have separate bedrooms, or at least separate beds within the same room. The logic was practical, or prudish, depending on who you ask. Separate beds meant fewer distractions, less snoring, and crucially, no temptation to engage in unplanned intimacy. Historians still argue whether this separation was born of modesty or of strategy. Some couples found it romantic, like courtship over and over again, sneaking between beds like star-crossed lovers. Others treated it more like polite avoidance. But for many, it was just another layer of distance. Take the infamous case of Mr. and Mrs. Abernathy, a middle-class couple from Manchester who slept in beds positioned at a strict 35-degree angle apart, close enough to speak of practical matters, but not close enough for impropriety. The space between them was filled with a tea table, 2 Bibles, and a chair they took turns sleeping in when troubled by urges. And then there's the bedding itself. Victorian linens were beautiful, but not cozy. Starched sheets, heavy counterpanes, intricately embroidered pillowcases that left facial imprints. It was comfort through suffering, and no part of it was spontaneous. But the most bizarre element of all? Beds that were too fancy to sleep in. That's right, some couples maintained display beds, made with such obsessive care that actually using them was considered gauche. Guests would admire them during house tours. Servants would dust them daily. But the master and mistress would tiptoe off to more practical cots elsewhere. One widow wrote that she only slept in her marriage bed twice in 30 years, and one of those times was an accident. Peter Webb reflects on this contradiction, that Victorian intimacy was often more about performance than pleasure. The bed wasn't a sanctuary, it was a stage. And if sleep happened to visit you while you lay there stiffly beneath 40 pounds of lace and shame, well, bully for you. Which brings us to another ironic twist. When people wanted real rest, they left the bedroom entirely. Couches, daybeds, chaise longues, these became havens for accidental naps and secret sighs. Some women confessed to sleeping better on nursery rugs than in their own beds. Others, particularly in creative circles, swore by lounging sleep, short, disobedient rests in sunrooms or attics, free from marital obligation and decorative pressure. One artist's wife kept a cot in her studio, claiming she could only sleep surrounded by unfinished paintings and the smell of turpentine. "It smells of freedom," she wrote, "and no one expects anything." Compare that to the expectations placed on the actual bed. Sex, but only when summoned, silence at all times, and sleep if you earned it through piety, quiet digestion, and an absence of dreams involving stable boys. This dynamic wasn't lost on the more cynical thinkers of the time. A pamphlet from 1885, unsigned but attributed to a certain tired gentleman of Essex, laments, why is it that the very place we are told to rest is lined with duties, ghosts, and embroidered slogans? He later adds, "My mattress whispers obligation, and I long for a hammock with no opinion." One quirky side note, beds were often passed down through generations, along with all their ghost stories. Many people believed spirits lived in the carved posts or within the mattress stuffing. This led to strange bedtime rituals, knocking on the bed frame, turning pillows 3 times before sleep, or tucking a sprig of rosemary between the sheets to keep the previous owner's dreams from returning. And so here you are, centuries later, lying in your own bed, which is likely more hygienic but probably less interesting. No carved serpents at the footboard, no ceremonial lace canopy, no spiritual rosemary tucked under your spine. Just you, and a mattress that doesn't judge. And yet some nights you still feel that pressure, that whisper of performance. The inherited ghost of Victorian sleep etiquette, nudging your ribs, asking, "Are you lying properly? Are your dreams tidy? Is your hand doing something it shouldn't?" Let it go. Roll over. Untuck the blankets. Let the sheets get a little wrinkled. If anyone asks, you're practicing historical empathy. And if you feel like dreaming of a bed that actually wants you there, soft, messy, maybe shared with someone inappropriate, well, that's between you and the mattress. The blanket's grown companionable now, no longer the prim and proper rectangle it started as, but a lumpy, lived-in hug. Your legs are tangled, your toes peeking out just enough to remind the air that you're still technically conscious. And that's good, because we're about to talk about how Victorian sexual repression even managed to invade interior design. Yes, tonight's tale involves wallpaper. If you've ever stared at your bedroom walls in the dark and found yourself hypnotized by the floral pattern, congratulations. You share a strange intimacy with many a Victorian sleeper who believed that one's decor could either protect or provoke the moral compass. Let's begin with the famous 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It's fiction, yes, but deeply autobiographical. In it, a woman suffering from nervous exhaustion is locked in a bedroom for rest and slowly descends into madness, convinced the wallpaper is alive and watching her. She sees shapes behind it, female figures trapped beneath the surface. Sounds extreme? Sure. But this was reality, stylized. Gilman herself had undergone the infamous rest cure, which forbade reading, writing, talking, and even thinking too much. She barely survived it. And the wallpaper? That was real. Historians still argue whether wallpaper itself caused anxiety, or simply became the screen onto which women projected their confined lives. The truth, predictably, is both. Victorian interior design wasn't just decorative, it was disciplinary. Bedrooms were not supposed to be sensuous. Comfort, yes, but not pleasure. Patterns were to be delicate, colors modest. No bright reds, too passionate, no golds, too decadent, and definitely nothing oriental. We'll get to that later. Blue was safest. Green was acceptable. Lavender was recommended, but only if it reminded you of your aunt, not your thighs. One particularly bizarre 1875 etiquette guide warned against the visual temptation of clustered blooms, claiming that too many floral motifs in a bedroom might incite unrestful fantasies. This same guide also recommended that lace curtains never be too sheer, lest the moonlight expose the form through shadow. So yes, Victorians were afraid of sunlight being too flirtatious, and yet they kept decorating like they were trying to suppress a scandal. Bedrooms were filled with moral signposts, portraits of stern ancestors, biblical embroidery, bless this house and keep it chaste, and tightly laced bed skirts to ensure no one saw anything under the frame. One woman insisted on tacking doilies to her husband's dresser knobs, just in case he was accosted by thoughts while selecting cufflinks. But there were exceptions, small ones, secret ones. Some people, usually artists, widows, or otherwise uncategorizable individuals, began to rebel subtly. A suggestive floral pattern here, a Japanese screen there, a painting of a woman whose neckline was, dare we say, relaxed. Peter Webb notes that Art Nouveau and aestheticism weren't just design movements, they were escape routes. A way of inserting sensuality into a room without being overt, curves instead of corners, vines instead of strict stripes, bedrooms that whispered, maybe you can rest as yourself. One woman, known only as Miss F, redecorated her guest bedroom with silk wallpaper printed with cranes and peach blossoms. She called it my peace room. Guests reported unusually good sleep and occasionally odd dreams involving water and whispering. One visitor refused to leave for 4 nights. It was the scandal of 1888. But back to the repression. Even furniture placement had sexual implications. Beds were rarely centered, too attention-seeking. Chairs had to face away from each other to encourage contemplation, not conversation. And heaven forbid you placed a mirror where it could reflect the bed. Some believe this invited the spirits of desire, which sounds poetic, until you remember that spirits, in Victorian logic, were usually blamed for everything. One real spiritualist claimed that his client's insomnia came from desire shadows, invisible energies attracted to provocative upholstery. He sold purity wallpaper in beige with tiny doves. It did not sell well. Of course, the repression wasn't limited to patterns. Lighting had rules too. Gas lamps were preferred over candles, less flicker, fewer romantic associations. Heavy curtains were drawn not just to block out light, but to block out thoughts. Windows were tightly latched, not just against the chill, but against the idea that anything might be watching. And yet, people still found ways to dream. One governess, writing anonymously, described her employer's guest bedroom as punishing, with walls so beige they felt like sermons. But inside her bureau drawer, she kept a tiny watercolor of a woman reclining in a garden. No signature, no frame, just folded paper and longing. I look at her before sleep, she wrote, so I can remember softness before the linen stiffens me. That's what it all comes back to, softness. The Victorian night was full of edges, moral, architectural, emotional, but underneath people ached for softness, in voice, in texture, in touch, and even in wallpaper. So next time you stare at your own walls in the dark, ask yourself, are they watching, are they judging, or are they just waiting for you to say, it's fine, you can sleep, you're allowed. The wallpaper doesn't mind. Your eyes have adjusted now, to the dark, to the weight of the blanket, to the idea that you may never sleep in a strictly Victorian way. And that's fine, because we're about to stroll into one of the few places in 19th century Britain where the rules bent just enough to let people breathe, the gentlemen's clubs that never slept. Not the cigar-chomping political dens we think of today. No, these were part social salon, part velvet-soaked refuge, and part nighttime confession booth, and they were everywhere. By the 1860s, London alone had over 400 private clubs. Some were grand, the Reform Club, the Athenaeum, the Travelers. Others were tucked away in quiet mews or above barbershops. Memberships ranged from hereditary peer to man of tolerable grooming and no criminal record. But what made them fascinating, especially to the sleepless, was their night culture. You see, these clubs often stayed open long after wives went to bed, and servants began their own whispered gossip. They were lantern-lit havens for men who couldn't or wouldn't go home. Why? Because home meant silence, expectation, or worse, self-examination. At the club, you could unbutton your collar, sip warm brandy, and pretend your insomnia was philosophical rather than emotional. One such place, the Circe Club, was known for its evening of civilized regressions. a weekly gathering where members shared readings, brandy, and deeply inappropriate essays under fake names. Their rules were simple: speak softly, stay clothed, and never ask what anyone dreams about. But not every club was so refined. Let's talk about Cremorne Gardens, part pleasure park, part proto-nightclub, part gentle descent into vice. Open until the wee hours, it was known for fireworks, music, and famously its unofficial brothel tucked behind the rose bushes. Gentlemen came not to sleep, but to remember why they didn't want to. As one newspaper delicately put it, Cremorne hosts those whose beds are too full or too empty. Historians still argue whether these clubs were outlets for pressure or simply diversions, but their function is clear. They offered space, not just physically but psychologically, a room where a man could admit in his own way that he was tired of pretending. Sex, of course, was present. Sometimes in hushed conversations, sometimes in the form of visiting dancers, sometimes just in the air, floating above the leather chairs and over-polished floors. But not all members came for that. Many came simply to exist among others who understood what it was to be exhausted in public. One diarist describes a conversation at a club near Piccadilly. We spoke of chess, then of cats, then of whether the heart could whisper while the mouth remained mute. I left feeling oddly comforted, also slightly drunk. Women weren't officially allowed in these spaces, but they hovered at the edges. Courtesans, widows, bold-minded actresses. Some clubs, like the Venus Society, operated in secret, female-run parlors where men paid for conversation, not contact. The motto, speak what is felt or remain unheard. Members claimed these sessions cured their insomnia. Doctors disagreed, passionately. One gentleman, a magistrate, wrote in a letter to his friend, I have not slept with ease since '68, but I find that if I hear a poem read at dusk and drink something amber at midnight, I can almost forget the hour. Which brings us to the real point. These clubs weren't about seduction, they were about sedation. Not the narcotic kind, but emotional, spiritual. They gave people permission to unravel, gently with cushions. And what about the design? Oh, the interiors, overstuffed chairs, velvet drapes. Gas lamps shaded with crimson glass. Everything suggested dimness, discretion, and the freedom to droop. One club even provided rest cloaks, robes to be worn after midnight if one wished to discuss life while supine. Peter Webb observes that these spaces operated like nocturnal drawing rooms of the soul. You could discuss desire, memory, doubt. You could lie without lying down. You could be touched, not by hands, but by understanding. One club president famously greeted new members with the line, "We offer what the night lacks, a place for your mind to change clothes." That sounds absurd until you've sat in a room where the only noise is the clink of a glass and the sound of someone finally saying what they've meant for years. And now, you understand. The club, like the den, like the secret diary, was not a threat to Victorian order. It was its safety valve. A place where men could feel what they could never articulate in the marriage bed, the office, or the pulpit. Back in your own bed, the room feels a little more permissive, as though you've joined some private velvet-robed society of the semi-conscious. Your thoughts are still wandering, yes, but they are not frantic now. They are being seated, handed a drink, asked politely, "Tell me what troubles you and would you like some brandy?" No judgment here, just company. There's a draft now, soft and uncertain, like a memory sneaking back into the room wearing someone else's slippers. It brushes past your cheek and brings with it the scent of lavender dust and old secrets. You're still not asleep, but that's all right. Because what comes next is a story about what happens when the body forgets it's being watched. Tonight, we step into the most accidental corners of the Victorian night. Sleepwalking, somniloquy, and midnight scandal. Let's begin with a true gem from the archives of the Edinburgh Lunacy Commission, 1886. A young man named Edward G., otherwise perfectly respectable, began sleepwalking at the age of 27. At first, it was harmless, standing at the foot of his bed, mumbling about taxes. Then one night, he was found halfway down the street in a nightshirt, carrying a hand mirror and reciting Ode to a Grecian Urn. Scandalous? Only mildly. But then came the confession. Edward's landlady testified that during one of his nocturnal episodes, he paused beside her door and whispered, "It's her. She's light, she's lace, she's," before wandering off. She never told him. She simply made him stronger tea in the morning and asked fewer questions. This wasn't rare. Victorians were fascinated and terrified by what people did while unconscious, especially if those actions hinted at desire, confusion, or truth. Sleep was supposed to be the time of purity, the body's reset. But when someone wandered at night, the assumption was clear: something in them wasn't resting properly. Historians still argue whether these incidents were treated as illnesses or moral failures. In many cases, it was both, especially for women. One governess was dismissed after being found in the kitchen at 2 a.m., muttering in French and stroking a loaf of bread like it was a lover. Her employers claimed she had a foreign condition. She later moved to Paris, where presumably both her appetite and accent were more appreciated. And then there were the letters. So many letters. Men and women confessing to dreams they didn't choose, whispers they didn't mean to say, hands that moved in sleep like they remembered something the mind had forgotten. One particularly delicate letter, sent anonymously to the Gentlewoman's Quarterly, read, "I awoke with my hand at my breast and a name on my tongue, a name that is not my husband's. I did not call it, but I miss it still." And just like that, sleep became not a refuge, but a courtroom. There were even cases of nocturnal testimony, people recorded as confessing secrets while asleep, affairs, regrets, longings. One man allegedly declared his love for his footman during a sleep talk episode. The footman heard it, so did the butler. The man woke up, pretended it hadn't happened, and then requested both men be transferred to another estate. He later installed new curtains. Peter Webb notes in The Erotic Spirit Through History that the subconscious often betrays what etiquette forbids. In the Victorian world, nighttime transgressions became the most honest part of one's day. No corset, no collar, just skin and instinct. But this honesty came at a cost. Some sleepwalkers were locked in their rooms at night. Others were made to wear bells or even chains. One particularly grim case involved a woman whose wrists were tied to the bedposts, not for her safety, but for her husband's dignity. She had a habit of reaching for him in sleep, and he couldn't bear what that implied. But not all tales are tragic. Let's return to 1874, to the case of Miss Eliza R., a young woman of sensitive disposition and literary ambition. She was reported to recite full scenes from Shakespeare in her sleep, often with voices. Her aunt, rather than send for a doctor, began writing them down. Eventually, they formed a play. It was published under a pseudonym. It did moderately well. Eliza never knew. And what about those who sleep wrote? Yes, it happened. One man kept a notebook under his pillow. He claimed he was simply recording dreams. But his wife discovered entire poems scribbled in the dark, verse about warm breath, soft mouths, and fingers that hesitate, then stay. He said it was fiction. She said it was someone else. They stopped sharing a bed. The poems, however, continued. In time, doctors tried to explain these phenomena: overstimulated nerves, weak digestion, and excess of sentimentality. But the truth is simpler. People's bodies wanted things they weren't allowed to say. So they said them at 3 a.m. when the gas lamps had dimmed and propriety was snoring. And that's what terrified Victorian society the most. Not the scandals, not the mutterings, but the truth. That sleep, so orderly in concept, was unruly in practice. It reminded them that beneath every moral code was a heartbeat, beneath every nightcap a pulse. Back in your room, you shift slightly. Your breath is steady now. Your hands rest where they land. You're not speaking aloud, yet, but if you did, you'd be forgiven. The room would listen. Outside, the first hints of dawn begin to smudge the edges of the sky. You haven't quite noticed, not really. You're nestled too deep into the story now, warm, still, heavy with hours of lace-trimmed confession. But this next part? Oh, it's delicious. Because now we wander into the folds of empire, where repression met revelation, and the Kama Sutra became Britain's most controversial bedtime read. Yes, tonight we uncover the secret British fan club of the Kama Sutra. You might assume the Kama Sutra was simply one of those exotic texts the Victorians avoided. Not so. In fact, by the mid-19th century, it had become a low-key obsession among certain members of Britain's upper class. Not openly, of course. No one discussed that over tea. But behind library doors and inside locked drawers, a slow, reverent, borderline sweaty relationship bloomed. Let's begin with Sir Richard Burton, explorer, linguist, beard enthusiast. and the man responsible for the first English translation of the Kama Sutra in 1883. Burton's work was controversial not because of the text itself, but because of his decision to publish it under the cover of Scientific Inquiry. He claimed it was anthropological, philosophical, and, in one memorable phrase, of academic interest to married persons seeking harmony. Historians still argue whether Burton was more rebel or opportunist. But there's little doubt that his translation ignited a very quiet fire among Britain's night readers. The Kama Sutra wasn't just about positions, though yes, there were many. It was about timing, preparation, the art of touch, emotional connection, and yes, how to fall asleep well after being held properly. Imagine that. Peter Webb reminds us that unlike Victorian guides, which were filled with warnings, dampening, and doilies, the Kama Sutra celebrated sensuality as a pathway to peace. Desire wasn't something to resist. It was a form of energy to be acknowledged, even cultivated, and then gently released into rest, which made it both dangerous and fascinating to Victorians who were routinely told their own bodies were not to be trusted. Enter the secret readers. Men and women alike began to circulate pirated copies. Often bound in plain leather, these editions were shared like scandalous heirlooms. Some had handwritten margin notes. Others had pages dog-eared with precision. One nobleman is said to have kept his copy inside a hollowed-out hymnal. Another, a widowed countess, paid a servant boy to read it aloud in a terrible accent so she could forget her own language. And while the public scoffed, the private bedrooms leaned in. Because the Kama Sutra was, for many, not just titillation, but permission. It gave language to longing, structure to touch, and most subversively, it treated women as pence, not decorations. Victorian marriage manuals rarely mentioned female pleasure at all. When they did, it was either as a marital duty or a lucky accident. In contrast, the Kama Sutra offered entire chapters on female delight, what it looked like, how to cultivate it, how to respond to it with care. Imagine being a woman in 1880, starved for agency, and suddenly reading, "Her sigh is not a weakness, but a wisdom. Follow it." One teacher in Brighton reportedly used the Kama Sutra's more philosophical passages as bedtime readings for herself. She would whisper, "The body knows what the mind resists," before turning in. She claimed it helped her sleep better than chloral ever did. Naturally, the backlash was swift. Moral societies attempted to ban the translation, calling it dangerous to the impressionable and the already bruised. Clergymen warned that to read it was to risk stirring foreign demons within. One bishop declared, "This book carries the scent of heat and disobedience," which, frankly, sounds like a 5-star review. But people kept reading, quietly, carefully, because the truth was, the Kama Sutra didn't scandalize them. It soothed them. It presented intimacy not as sin, but as comfort. Not a duty, but a dialogue. And perhaps most radically, it said that good sleep might begin with good touch. That concept? Absolutely unthinkable in Victorian England, and yet entirely true. Burton himself was rumored to sleep with the book under his pillow. His wife, Isabel, claimed he sought comfort through comprehension. That's probably code, but it also might be the most British sentence about passion ever written. One curious anecdote comes from a letter found in a Welsh manor. A woman wrote to her sister, "He read to me from a book I cannot name, and then for the first time I slept without hearing my mother's voice in my head." The book was never identified. But the clue? She signed it, "Yours in stillness and finally full." Let's be honest, the Kama Sutra didn't change Victorian society. It didn't overthrow the corset or light the lampshades on fire, but it offered, for a select few, a door, a passage into selfhood, into rest that didn't require sedation or shame. And tonight that door still waits. You don't need Sanskrit. You don't need incense. You don't even need a nobleman with a shaky voice. You just need permission to lie back, to exhale, to believe that maybe the path to peace includes softness, breath, and maybe, a little heat. Your breathing is slower now. The stories have curled themselves around you like a second quilt, strange, velvet-lined, and embroidered with forgotten shame and secret laughter. You've drifted with queens, walked with ghostly governesses, tasted sleep behind lace curtains. But just before we settle in for our final descent, we must detour, briefly, bravely, into one last cabinet of curiosity, the bizarre world of Victorian bedtime products. Yes, The age of repression also happened to be the golden age of truly unhinged sleep aids. Some promised rest, others promised purity, a few promised mental quietude. Most delivered none of the above. Let's begin with a classic, Dr. Miller's nocturnal enclosure garments. A real product, patented in 1873, it was essentially a sleeping bag for morality. Thick canvas, full body wrap, closed with 20 buttons and a belt. Its purpose? To deter unseemly nighttime behavior. Its effect? Mild asphyxiation and several broken buttons per week. Or how about the dormitorium chair? Designed by an inventor in Bath, this upright sleeping apparatus promised to prevent dream sin and spinal curve. Imagine a wooden armchair lined with horsehair, a neck brace, and a small bell that rang if you slumped forward. 8 were sold. 3 returned with angry notes. 1 was reportedly burned in a public garden. There was also the midnight helmet, a brass contraption worn over the head, said to align the brain's energies by funneling divine thoughts through the crown. It looked like a kettle, buzzed faintly when damp, and occasionally exploded. And the drinks, oh, the tonics. You could sip Bishop's Bedtime elixir, containing a cocktail of port wine, laudanum, nutmeg, and what one reviewer called a suspicious amount of mercury. Or, if you preferred something non-liquid, there were dream tablets for moral sleep, tiny white pills made of chalk, camphor, and vague fear. One particularly misguided product, Dr. Holloway's nightly sedative band, was worn around the abdomen. Advertised to relax tension in the stomach and the spirit, it was mostly a corset turned inside out. It squeaked when you breathed. Historians still argue whether these inventions were genuine attempts at wellness or elaborate metaphors for how absurd the Victorian relationship to sleep and sex really was. Perhaps both, because beneath the layers of tulle and tincture was a deep, anxious longing to control what should have been natural. Even the smells were weaponized. Bedrooms were filled with sachets of anti-lust lavender, virtue rosewater, and something called cedar for the restraint of thought. One diary entry mentions a woman who burned sage nightly to keep her dreams holy. Her husband later claimed it gave him erotic visions of shrubbery. And lighting? Gas lamps were fitted with moral diffusers, glass shades designed to make light less suggestive. Because, as you now know, even moonlight was sometimes too forward. But not all bedtime contraptions were about denial. A small underground market began to emerge in the 1880s. Products that, while never openly sensual, clearly catered to the unmet needs of sleepless Victorians. Take the companion cushion, a bolster shaped vaguely like a human torso, marketed as a rest for widows and others of tender constitution. Or the resting hand, a porcelain glove mounted on a stand, designed to offer tactile reassurance without impropriety. One user claimed, "It feels like being remembered by someone who never existed." And of course, there was the whispering box, a wooden cube that played soft wind sounds or, when wound differently, the voice of a stranger reciting poetry. They were often customized. One nobleman had his box recite the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in a baritone. Another had his say nothing at all, just a sigh. "It was enough," he wrote. "It made me feel seen by no one." Some of these artifacts still exist, tucked away in museums, mislabeled as miscellaneous domestic. Most, however, vanished into attics or were destroyed by grandchildren too confused or embarrassed to ask questions. And yet, their spirit lingers, because what all these strange gadgets had in common was this: a desire to bridge the gap between longing and rest, to soothe the animal in the body with contraptions built by a society that couldn't say what it wanted out loud. Peter Webb once wrote, "Even the strangest inventions are love letters in disguise." Maybe that's what every strap, tincture, and tingling glove really was, a quiet plea. Help me sleep, help me feel, help me be okay with both at once. Back in your room, you take stock. No strange helmets, no belts of virtue, just you, your mattress, and perhaps a stray throw pillow with questionable intent. The products may be gone, but the wish behind them remains, to rest without fear, to want without apology, to sleep like no one is watching, and if they are, that they love you anyway. Here we are, the final stretch of the night. You can feel it, somewhere behind your eyes, behind your ribs, behind the quiet. The stories have softened. The laughter has dulled to a sleepy hum. And though your mind may still flutter with embroidered gowns and clinking decanters, Your body is ready to be still. We've journeyed through the strangest beds, the most judgmental curtains, the loneliest asylums, and the secret drawers of the Victorian mind. But all of it, every lace cuff, every awkward tonic, every whispered confession, was chasing one thing: the great sleep that never came. Victorian England was obsessed with order, and sleep, it was the final battleground, a place where the rules could no longer hold, where bodies did what they wanted, where desire slipped through seams and silence became slippery. And so they fought it, with potions, with pamphlets, with prayer, with curtains so thick even the moon gave up trying. And still, they tossed and turned, because deep down, the Victorian night was lonely, not just in the sense of solitude, but in the sense of being unseen. You could share a bed, a marriage, a whole house, and still feel like you were the only one awake. Awake with your needs, your stories, your restless skin, and noisier thoughts. Historians still argue whether all this repression made people stronger or just sadder. But we know this much: they were trying to be good, trying to be loved, trying to be allowed to dream without punishment. And sometimes, they succeeded. One last diary entry: a widow in Bristol. Tonight, I read until I forgot his scent, and then, strangely, I slept. I didn't dream of him. I dreamt of water. That feels like progress. A tiny line, a big sigh. Because maybe that's all we ever really want: to stop holding our breath, to lie down and feel okay. Not heroic, not holy, just enough. And maybe that's the final truth of Victorian insomnia. It wasn't about lust or lunacy. It was about people being told that rest must be earned and daring in their own quiet ways to take it anyway. So tonight, you're invited to do the same. Forget the corset of your day, the bells of your guilt, the wallpaper of your thoughts. This room has no sermon. This bed requires no oath. The only permission slip is your breath. And with that, let your body soften now. Unclench what's clenched. Jaw, shoulders, hips. Let the blanket hold you, not like an obligation, but like a secret that never needs to be kept. Let your breath lengthen. Not deep, not forced, just enough to make room for quiet. You've heard strange things tonight: furniture with opinions, powdered sedatives, men dreaming in Latin. You've walked corridors where silence pressed against your ribs and laughed softly at confessions too fragile for daylight. You've seen what sleep looked like when it was forbidden, when desire was disguised as illness, when softness was regulated by wallpaper patterns. But you've also seen how people, stubborn, beautiful, sleepless people, found their way to rest anyway, through poetry, through rebellion, through whispered verses in the dark. So now lie still. Let the dark come in, not as punishment, but as kindness, as a soft hand tucking you in. Let the hum of the room surround you. Let it be enough. And if your mind keeps moving, gently remind it that nothing is required of you now. You've heard the stories, you've traveled the night, and now you are safe to sleep. Nothing left to understand, nothing left to fix. Just drift.